I want to ask you a little bit about some of your training and just a little bit of your background, how you went from medicine to where you are now, the combination of the two things.
I started out in a residency in pediatrics, and then, but I've always loved to read, and I've always loved to write, and I, about halfway through, just wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with it, and the little children's bookstore in our community was going out of business, and my wife and I decided to come in and rescue it, and we renamed it Blue Manatee, and it's now been in business for 28 years. We've run it for about 15 of those. But through my experience at Blue Manatee, I developed a deeper and deeper interest in the importance of parents and kids reading together, and that ritual that I was fortunate to grow up with. When I was little, my mom always read to us, and we had a little community bookstore we'd go to, or the library, and that was just such a big part of my childhood, and it became very, very important to me to sort of pursue that in pediatrics and to do what I could to better understand the importance of reading and how to help make sure that families have that same opportunity that I did. It just so happened that when I went back to training, that Cincinnati Children's, where I work, was developing actually a center called the Reading and Literacy Discovery Center that's all about better understanding the early influences on, it's called the home reading environment, how that comes into play to help kids learn to read, and then also better understanding reading difficulties and dyslexia and other learning disabilities that can get in the way of kids having successful reading experiences. So,
I want to start by asking you first about the research in layman's terms, how you guys went about actually studying what happens in the brain. Sure. When somebody is reading.
So in 2014, the American Academy of Pediatrics released official guidelines for the first time explicitly saying that parents should begin reading to their children as often as possible, as close to birth as possible. And that recommendation was based on research that was largely done within a program called Reach Out and Read, where they really looked at families' access to books, how often they're reading to the kids, and what the impact of providing books earlier and encouraging reading earlier would have on families' attitudes towards reading, and also language development and other social emotional development. Within that recommendation, there's a statement that reading promotes healthy brain development, but at the time there had not been any imaging-based research really showing what parts of the brain may be involved. I'm fortunate that at Cincinnati Children's, a lot of my colleagues are very, very expert in using MRI, specifically functional MRI, to understand how language develops in the brain, and basically understanding the development of brain networks for all types of cognitive abilities. But we decided to look at the recommendation and really dig deeper into it and see what impact does the early reading environment prior to kindergarten have on the developing brain. And so we took a group of about 19 preschoolers, 3 to 5 years old, from diverse socioeconomic background, and brought them in for MRI. And in the MRI task, they went in and were presented with stories through headphones. And these are all age-appropriate, simple narratives. And we measured their brain activity listening to the stories. And then from that, we asked the parents questions about the early reading environment of the child. How often were they read to? How many books do they have at home? What kind of variety of books are being read? And what we found was that the children who had a stronger, richer early reading experience had greater activation in a part of their brain during the story task that supports two things. One, it's called semantic processing, which is basically understanding of what's going on in the story. And the second was visual imagery, basically the use of imagination to see in the mind's eye what's happening during the story. Interestingly, during the story task, there were no pictures. It was all audio. But we found that these kids still were activating visual parts of their brain that really showed that they're bringing the story to life in their mind's eye. And as you would expect, trying to sort of, if they heard a line of the story, the frog jumped over the log, they'd say, okay, well, I've seen a log before, I've seen a frog before, this is what that must look like.
What does that mean for their development down the road? If you're seeing that their brain is firing and they're scoring well or doing well in these two areas, what does that mean down the road and for their development as they get older?
There's a phrase in neuroscience, neurons that fire together wire together. So the idea is that the more stimulation that the child has in different parts of their brain, whether it's language or later reading, the more those networks are stimulated and connect and come together. Interestingly, reading is not a skill that humans are hardwired to know how to do. It's a fairly recent development culturally. It's only about 5,000 years old, and in terms of brain development and evolution, that's not very much time. So the whole process of learning to read is essentially a knitting together of different older aspects of the brain, language and vision and executive function, memory, and the way those networks come together is through practice. So what we found is that kids that have greater early exposure to reading through being read to by a parent starting as young as possible are going to have more practice stimulating these different areas of their brain, and then eventually as they are challenged to do more and more during story reading, whether it's repeating what the parent says in the book or eventually learning how to read words and then sentences, those brain networks are going to come together, and eventually the magic will happen where they can read themselves. So in a nutshell, the more practice children have early and the more those brain networks are stimulated, the greater the chance they're going to become successful readers later on.
For a child that reads well, what does that do for school success?
It's really critical. One thing that's very clear in pediatrics, and what we're trying to reinforce at Cincinnati Children's, is that reading is more than just a nice thing to do with a child if there's time. It really is a critical aspect of brain health and social emotional development. We know that children who do not read well, whether it's due to an organic problem, which is about 5 to 12%, which may have what's called dyslexia, or more commonly just inadequate exposure to reading and books. Children that are not reading well by the time they get to grade school, and particularly third grade when they switch from learning to read to reading to learn, are at risk for all kinds of health problems, whether it's teen pregnancy, substance abuse, mental health problems, depression, obesity even. Kids that don't read well tend to have lower health literacy and don't take care of themselves, have lower self-esteem. So truly, learning to read is a critical aspect of early development that has broad implications for the child for the rest of their life.
What is the home reading environment?
So home reading environment is really the aspect of a child's development before they get to school. So from birth through either 3 or 5 years old. If a child gets into preschool and a quality preschool, 3 to 5 years old, then they're going to have more access to reading than that. But most of the reading that goes on in the early years is at home. The aspects of that home reading environment are essentially access to books. Are there books at home? And then there are programs that can help provide books, whether it's the public library or Imagination Library is one, or Reach Out and Read, and a lot of community-based programs. There's frequency of reading, how often a child is read to, whether it's, we recommend every day for at least 15 minutes per day. And there's actually a group called Read Aloud 15 Minutes that's all about that, just really preaching that every day, 15 minutes, make it part of the routine. And then there's also the quality of reading, that back and forth aspect of reading. Reading to a child is important no matter how it's done, but what's really the secret sauce of making the reading experience most powerful is bringing the child into the process and helping them participate. So as you're reading a story, as you'll often see, take time to stop and ask questions. Let the child participate. Let them point out what they see on the page that's meaningful to them, whether it's if they like dogs and there's a dog on the page, talk about dogs. What kind of dogs does the child like? If it's animals, maybe talking about a trip to the zoo and things like that. But really making the book more of a conversation tool, a way to bring the grown-up and child together to talk about the book and how the child feels about the book and develop that relationship.
Are there particular kinds of books that are better than others?
The best type of book is the one that the parent and child will read together, one that spurs their interest. A lot of children like books about animals. They like books about outer space or relationships, friendships, funny things. For the most part, I think it's useful if the child is brought into the process of picking the book. So if there are choices the parent can say, well, do you want to read about, colors, or you want to read about shapes, or do you want to read about dogs or cats, whatever it is. So bringing the child into the process of choosing a book is very important. In the early years, really it's just all about language. Just the more words you can bring into a child's life, the better. That doesn't mean the book needs to have all the words. There are wordless books where the parent can provide the words and talk about what's going on the page. A lot of parents will have some concerns about, the book's too long, or it's too complicated, and what's the perfect kind of book. And really, the parent can supply part of the dialogue by talking about what's on the page just in their own language, and bringing their own feelings into the story, and not just reading the words on the page and leaving it at that. But so early on, it's just the more words, the better. As kids get older into preschool, bringing concepts in, helping child learn their alphabet, helping them learn what sounds letters make is going to help prepare them to learn to read later on. And fundamental concepts, counting and shapes are also helpful for school.
So this really is the building block of everything else?
I think so. So reading is really such a critical foundation for a child in so many ways.
One of the things that you had mentioned, recommendation every day, 15 minutes a day reading. Is it so important? Have it 15 minutes? Could it be 5 minutes broken up?
The routines really are important. We advocate starting as close as possible to birth for at least 15 minutes. And a lot of parents will say, well, my child is an infant, they're not going to understand what I'm reading, what's the point? And really it's about creating that ritual, that daily, every day, like brushing teeth, like eating lunch, whatever it is, we're going to carve out. And whether it's 5 minutes, 15 minutes, or an hour, we think 15 minutes is a reasonable threshold that hopefully all families can find in their day, even though it seems like as busier than ever. A lot of families have pressures that are about getting enough food on the table, or getting to work and working 2 jobs, and there really is very little time. But still, above all that, having the reading be a sanctuary from all that pressure, and a time to really slow down and read together, we hope is going to be something that's fun, and also will let the parent know they're contributing to their child's brain development. For a lot of families that are very wired and plugged in, we've created more pressures for ourselves with the temptation to check email at all hours of the day, and work from home. And it's important that I think parents become good role models in terms of their use of technology, to put the devices away, sit down together, and try to find that sanctuary. And really it's good for the parent too. I mean, reading is perceived as strictly beneficial for the child, but we hope it's also beneficial for the parent to find a way to slow down and breathe and really enjoy that connection with their child.
Is there anything I didn't ask you that you would want people to make sure they take away from this?
Yeah, I think that one thing we're really trying to do in our research is to take the very considerable amount of evidence that's shown that reading is good for children. It helps build language. It helps prepare children for school. It helps build healthy attitudes towards reading going forward. But we're really trying to drill down into how reading shapes the developing brain, and that's really a frontier. In the first 5 years of life, if for no other reason, it's hard for children to sit still in an MRI scanner. We're really trying to bring them in and look at all these different aspects of the early reading environment, and try to point at parts of the brain that are influenced by these different aspects of reading environment. We know they tend to be in language areas, both in the imagination parts of the brain, the understanding parts of the brain, and then also more recently a study that's hasn't been published yet, but it's on the way, is looking at the more interactive reading experiences really seems to influence the frontal parts of the brain in the expressive language areas, and also areas that are involved with processing of social emotional skills. Not just what's being read, but how what's being read matters to the child. Connecting it with their feelings, and by doing that, we may be verifying the obvious to a certain degree. Like we'll hear from people, well, we've always known reading is good for children, but we think it's really important to understand how that magic is happening within the brain, and really that reading truly is an aspect of healthy brain development, and as critical as eating a healthy diet, as brushing teeth, as exercising. It's a essential nutrient for for long-term brain health. We actually just finished a study last year where we looked at parents' attitudes. And this is a group of lower income families that are very at risk for reading problems, first-time mothers, and looked at about 270, and we compared attitudes towards reading prenatally to reading behaviors at 2 months old, and also towards television. And what we found was really interesting. Before the child was born, we're fairly in line with recommendations. The parents were saying that they wanted to start reading early. There probably wouldn't be a lot of major barriers to that, and they wanted to put off television until after the child was a year old. By the time these children were 2 months old, what we found was the attitudes had really shifted. And a lot of parents were reading, but not very often, about 1 to 3 days per week, and the reason was too busy. Far and away, the number one was just time pressures, feeling like there's just not enough time in the day. And then television, by contrast, about half the children were watching television every day, with the perception that television was a healthy substitute for reading, that it was okay. And what that really showed us was that parents really are thinking about the plans for their baby before the baby's born, and those early attitudes and behaviors really are influenced in the first couple months of life. And we know that those can really set the foundation for long-term habits and behaviors. So it's very important for parents to think about their plans to read to their child as early as possible, and really set in their mind what is a healthy routine. And if they can get in their mind that, okay, I'm going to commit myself to read to my child every day for 15 minutes, starting as early as possible, we hope that the earlier they commit to that, and commit in a good way, like make the pledge to their child to really help them develop as healthy as possible, that we hope that will create a really increase the chances that those healthy habits will carry forward, and these kids will have the greatest possible opportunities to be healthy.